A German shepherd stumbled through a fierce Wyoming blizzard, limping, his fur matted with frost and stained with dried blood. He was never meant to be discovered again. Yet beyond the shattered wall of a broken shed, a young mother trembled, carrying 5 tiny lives within her, with time slipping away fast. No one saw the man approach. No one believed he'd dare open his door to danger, but he never forgot what it felt like to be rescued. And he held tight to a vow to love, even when it hurts the most. What unfolds next will tug at your heartstrings and restore your faith in second chances. But before we dive in, share where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no soul, whether human or animal, should be left out in the cold, hit subscribe to witness more true stories of miracles. The towering peaks of northern Wyoming lay buried beneath a heavy winter blanket. Snow had fallen unabated for 3 days straight, while the wind whipped through the valley with a savage force that stripped bark from the ancient cottonwoods. It was late January, a time when the little town of Elk Ridge, just a smattering of ranches and a lone diner, felt less like a place on a map and more like a stubborn outpost clinging to life against the freezing odds. The storm descending from the Bighorn Mountains that night was no ordinary snowfall. It came with ferocity, howling across the plains like a roaring freight train tearing at window shutters, piling snowbanks higher than any man and wiping away roads beneath blank torrents of ice. Inside a humble ranch house perched on the valley's edge, Matthew Harris stacked another log onto the fire, watching amber flames claw and dance upward. At 39, Matthew still bore the unmistakable mark of discipline. His 6-foot frame showed the lean, honed toughness of a man who had spent 2 decades serving as a Marine fighting battles in lands half a world away. His hair, dark chestnut now streaked with silver at the temples, was clipped short, a habit from his service he'd never abandoned. His strong jaw, weathered by desert sun and mountain wind alike, held lines that aged him further when flickered by firelight. There was a calmness about him, a soldier's patience, but beneath it simmered a quiet ache of deep loneliness. Matthew had been back in Wyoming for 4 years now, and in that time the ranch had been both sanctuary and cage. He had returned after his wife Claire was taken suddenly by an illness no battle could have prepared him to fight. She had been his guiding light, the constant warmth in his life, and when she was gone, the world shifted off its axis. His military training taught endurance, but never how to face an empty chair at the table, or how to fall asleep in a bed far too wide for a man alone. On nights when storms like this raged, the silence of the house pressed on him as fiercely as the wind against the walls. He rubbed a calloused hand across his face, muttering to himself, a lonely habit that had grown since Claire's passing. He checked on the horses, then returned to the fire. His voice, low and gravelly, was nearly swallowed by the howling wind battering the eaves. It wasn't that he doubted the horses' strength. They were tough, hardy creatures bred for Wyoming's harsh winters. But storms like this had a way of claiming even the strongest. Pulling on thick insulated coveralls and wrapping a wool scarf tight over his mouth, Matthew stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a relentless blow, icy shards biting at his cheeks mercilessly. His boots crunched through the deep snow as he pushed forward against the relentless wind, the thin beam of his flashlight piercing a fragile path through the swirling white tempest. Beyond that narrow circle of light, chaos swallowed the world whole. The barn appeared, just a shadowy form, until he neared enough to glimpse the snow-laden roof's outline. Inside, warmth lingered, thick with the earthy aroma of hay and the steady breathing of horses. They clustered close, their dark eyes catching his light. Coats dusted with frost drifting in through the cracked boards. They were tranquil, as though oblivious to the storm's fury raging beyond the wooden walls. Matthew checked each stall, his hand sliding down a sleek coat, whispering comforts more to steady his own spirit than theirs. The barn stood firm, stocked with enough hay to last several days. He should have turned away then, letting the storm own the night and leaving the valley to its quiet. But as he moved to secure the door, a faint sound sliced through the howl. subtle fragments borne on the wild gusts. He froze, straining to pick it out from the creaks of timber and the clatter of snow on tin. There it was again, fragile and pleading unlike the woods groan or ice's crack, an unfamiliar cry breaking through the storm's rage. Matthew lifted his head, tuning his ears with fierce focus. It was faint, broken, but unmistakable, the bark of a dog, not the steady call of a seasoned working hound, but a ragged plea drenched in desperation. The old hardened instincts stirred, the sharp battlefield intuition that warned him when something had gone wrong, when a shadowed voice called for urgent aid. He hesitated, murmuring that it was only the horses then to the warmth of the fire. But the cry pierced the gale once more, raw with suffering tightening in his chest. He swung the flashlight's beam toward the old shed leaning silently at the far edge of the yard, half swallowed by towering snowdrifts, untouched for years, a fragile frame of gray wood and rusted tools. Yet that was where the desperate sound had traveled. For a moment, reason battled instinct. In these brutal conditions, every extra step into the storm could cost a man his way, and see him lost mere yards from safety. But the cry came back again, faint yet clear, and with it came the haunting memory of a voice long ago, a battlefield plea that still haunted his dreams. He could no more ignore it now than he had then. Pulling his scarf tighter, Matthew plunged forward through the snow, battling each step as drifts rose well above his knees. The flashlight wobbled in his grasp, its fragile glow sliding over twisted metal and shattered timber, reminders of a time when the shed stored hay baling tools. The storm thundered all around, but as the light caught a hollow near an old tractor hitch, the sound sharpened, potent and undeniable. He pressed closer, the beam stabbing into the shadowed void, and there, huddled against the wall, were two shapes that rooted him to the spot. Two German shepherds, the larger one. A male, judging by his broad chest and sturdy frame, sprawled weakly in the snow, his once rich black and tan coat glazed over with ice, each breath trembling through his worn body, his head lifted slightly, eyes a fading amber dulled by exhaustion, yet still burning with a fierce, undying defiance. Beside him, the female shivered so violently it seemed she might shatter apart. Beneath the thick blanket of snow and ice, Matthew spotted the swell of her belly, the unmistakable fullness that spoke of new life on the way. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his wide and golden, pleading silently, with a depth far beyond words. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. In all his years in Wyoming, he'd come across stray animals left to wander the roadside without care. But this was different. These were no wild creatures or wolves. These were dogs shepherds bred for unwavering loyalty, discipline, and service. A knot twisted in his stomach. Someone had heartlessly abandoned them here amidst the storm, leaving them to fend for their lives. The male shifted, trying to rise and protect the female from this stranger, but weakness overcame him, and he crumpled back with a low, broken growl that faded into a hoarse cough. The female nudged him gently, her body sagging with exhaustion, as if urging him to rest. Her ears flicked once, twice, then she uttered a faint chirp, a sound more like surrender than a warning. Matthew knelt down in the snow, his gloved hand trembling as it held the flashlight's beam. He whispered, voice almost a prayer, "God, please." The storm howled overhead. The old barn groaned behind him, and in that silent moment the crushing weight of a decision settled on his shoulders. He had mere minutes, perhaps even less, before the relentless cold would claim them both. Yet still he faltered briefly, seized by the sharp sting of memory. Claire's gentle, teasing voice echoed inside him. "You always find strays, Matt. You just can't turn away. You see something lost, and it haunts you until you bring it home." He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them to the fragile lives trembling in the snow. His whisper came again, softer, now filled with resolve. "Not tonight. Not while I'm here." Outside, the storm raged across Elk Ridge, a fierce tempest of snow and wind that devoured the landscape whole. Matthew crouched low against the snowdrift, his flashlight trembling as its beam searched the hollow beside the old shed. The two German shepherds lay still. For a heart-stopping moment he feared he'd arrived too late, that the storm's wrath had already claimed them. Then he caught it, the faint rise and fall of their chests, the stubborn drumbeat of survival. The male was larger, his powerful frame dulled and weary from exhaustion. His coat, a sable blend with black, had lost its shine beneath the icy glaze. Gray whispered at the edges of his muzzle, maybe 6 or 7 years old enough to understand the meaning of loyalty, yet still young enough to fight with everything he had left. His ears drooped, but his amber eyes burned with the fierce vigilance of a guardian who would never abandon his post. Gaunt from hunger ribs pressing faintly against his fur, he curved protectively around the female, shielding her, as if from the storm itself. The female, smaller and more fragile, trembled under his sheltering weight. Her coat was a lighter tan, streaked with black along her back, and her belly bloomed with the heavy promise of unborn life. She looked barely 3 or 4 years old, a young mother thrust into danger far too soon. Her golden eyes, dulled by the cold, met Matthew's with a fragile and pleading gaze piercing right through his scarf and straight into his heart. Her muzzle twitched. From her breath came a faint puff of steam as she gave a soft whimper, almost human in its anguish. Matthew's instincts sharpened instantly. His years in the Marines had honed him to read danger fast, judging a situation with just one glance. The conflict swirled inside him. Were these strays abandoned and helpless, or wild enough to turn dangerous if he stepped too close in Afghanistan? He'd once encountered shepherds trained for combat, and lean and relentless, their loyalty had been tempered in the harshest fires. The thought flickered, then her eyes pleaded once more, shattering the calculations in his mind. He spoke softly, his voice muffled by the scarf, but steady as steel. Easy now. The male lifted his head, emitting a hollow growl before collapsing back down. It wasn't a threat, more a habit, a fading echo of defiance from a soul too worn to fight any longer. Something inside Matthew loosened. He knew that sound. It was the same echo heard from warriors who fought until their bodies failed, refusing to surrender until mercy was the only option left. The storm battered the shed's walls, rattling loose boards, reminding Matthew of the unforgiving minutes slipping away. He slipped his flashlight into the crook of his arm and reached for the coat draped over his shoulders. His breath hung heavy in the cold as he pulled it free. Suddenly, an unwelcome memory surfaced. Claire's laughter, her tender rebukes whenever he brought home a stray in those younger days. Once it was a starving cat, another time a broken-winged bird. "You can't save everything, Matt," she'd say. Yet her hands fed the cat, and her warm care nursed the bird back to life. That was her essence. She carried kindness like a constant heartbeat. Now, 4 years past her death, Matthew felt her spirit in the storm standing beside him, whispering patience into his ear. He knelt by the dogs, ignoring the cold biting his knees. The male trembled, but did not lash out. The female whimpered softly, her ears flicking as he pulled the heavy coat over both of them. "Valor," he whispered to the male, the name rising from deep within. "You've done your duty. Rest now." To the female, he breathed the name Grace. "Hold on just a little longer." Those names clung to them naturally, as relentless as the storm gripping the valley. Matthew paused once more, his trained eye scanning for wounds. Valor's paws were cracked, blood darkening the snow beneath them. Grace's swollen belly held life, but she was too thin, her ribs sharp beneath his touch. They'd been abandoned, left alone for far too long. That truth hit harder than the storm's fury. Someone had left them, chained and forgotten or discarded to fend for themselves. The cruelty ignited a dark fire within him, the old wartime rage stirring the bitter fury toward those who abandon others to die. He tightened the coat around them, sliding his arms beneath their frail bodies. They were lighter than they should be, bones pressing through sparse fur. Yet together they weighed heavier than his rifle ever had. Snow lashed across his face as he rose, their limp forms pressed close to his chest. For a moment he swayed, the storm threatening to wrench him off balance. but he rooted his boots, deep muscles straining as he pushed forward toward the house. Each step was a battle, the drifts clawing at his legs, the storm trying to pry the weight from his grasp. Valor stirred weakly, a paw twitched, but Grace lay still, her head resting against his arm, her belly rising faintly. Matthew gritted his teeth and continued. He muttered like a mantra under his breath. One step more, just one more. The house emerged from the darkness, a shadow, then a sanctuary. He shoved the door open, nearly stumbling into the mudroom snow trailing in behind him. Warmth hit his face, but he didn't hesitate. Gently, he lowered the dogs onto the woven rug by the hearth, wrapping his coat tighter around their shivering forms. They lay still, their breaths shallow and faint. Falling to his knees, his chest rose and fell in heavy gasps. His eyes locked on them, as if willing them back from the brink. Outside, the storm raged wildly, yet inside that fragile circle of firelight, something began to change. Valor's eyes flickered open, amber and gleaming, fixed on Matthew, with a gaze that seemed to measure the very depth of his soul. Grace's ear twitched gently, a soft sigh barely breaking the stillness. It was enough a fragile reminder that life still flickered within them, delicate yet alive. Matthew leaned back, brushing snow from his beard. For the first time in many years, he whispered a prayer aloud. Not tonight. They've come too far. Not tonight. The fire crackled behind him, sparks leaping up the chimney like fleeting hopes. But Matthew Harris didn't pause to warm his frozen fingers. His breath billowed in freezing puffs as he knelt beside the rug where the two German shepherds lay wrapped in the warmth of his heavy coat. Valor. The elder male twitched faintly, his paw nudging the thick wool, while Grace, the younger female, remained motionless, except for a slight shiver from her swollen belly. Their fur clung heavy, with ice melting slowly into the fabric wrapped around them, and the bitter cold of the storm seemed to have followed them inside, settling into their very bones. He knew the danger bringing them indoors was a reckless act, fueled by nothing but compassion. These weren't pets, nor his own. They weren't even strays he'd chosen. They were strangers, their histories a tangled mystery. They might carry disease. They might turn hostile once their strength returned. Yet as he looked at them, Matthew realized his choice wasn't one of logic. It was pure primal instinct. The same fierce instinct that once drove him across a battlefield under fire to save a fallen brother. In the harsh lands of Afghanistan, he had hauled Corporal Anthony Morales across half a kilometer of exposed ground bullets, snapping terrifyingly close overhead, Morales's blood staining his camouflage shirt. Morales survived, though his left leg was lost. The look of pain and gratitude in his eyes afterward reminded Matthew why men are willing to risk their lives for one another. And now, looking into the eyes of Valor and Grace, he felt that same urgent pull. These weren't soldiers, but their silent plea was the same. Don't leave us here. He rose, every muscle aching from carrying them through the furious storm. His own coat was now a shroud around the dogs, so he grabbed a blanket from the couch and draped it across his shoulders. The room held the sharp scent of wet fur and wood smoke, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. Moving steadily, Matthew filled a kettle at the sink and placed it on the stove. His gaze fell to the old rotary phone hanging on the wall, the one Claire had insisted they keep. He thought about calling Dr. Emily Carter in town, a vet he knew only by reputation. Emily was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with sharp shoulders, and a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency. Folks in Elkridge said she'd once worked in Denver at a busy urban clinic, but had returned to the quiet Wyoming hills after losing her husband in a car crash. Grief had carved its mark on her face, and she devoted herself to animals with a fierce intensity as if they were her only prayer. He'd always respected her from a distance, but tonight the storm had locked the town away completely. The roads would be impassable until dawn. If he reached out for help, she could only offer advice. There was no way she could make it through tonight. He returned to the living room and knelt by the fire. Valor's eyes flickered open once more, amber flames reflecting in their depths. Suspicion lingered in that gaze, but there wasn't the strength to act on it. Grace shifted weakly, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Matthew whispered softly, "Take it easy now. You're safe." His voice, roughened from years of command and harsh storms, softened in a way it hadn't for a very long time. He understood what needed to be done. Leaning forward, he tugged at the hem of his coat, then gently removed the ice from their fur with a rag warmed by the fire. His hands remained steady, though his heartbeat raced as if he were tending a wound in the heart of battle once again. Valor bore the touch, trembling, but still enduring. Grace made a faint sound caught somewhere between fear and relief, and Matthew murmured quiet reassurances as he worked. As he wiped away the frost, he examined them closely. Valor's paw was cracked and bleeding, yet old scars marked his sides. He appeared once trained, maybe a guard dog or service animal. Grace carried no such scars. Her body looked younger, her gaze gentler despite the pain. Together they seemed like an unlikely pair bonded solely by the will to survive. The kettle began to whistle. Matthew poured warm water into a bowl and set it down, nudging it softly toward Valor. The dog sniffed, then lapped once, twice before his strength gave out, and his head drooped again. Grace weakly lifted her muzzle, her tongue flicking at the water's surface. Not much, but it was something. Matthew settled back, pulling a blanket around his shoulders, watching over them. Outside, the storm hammered. The windows shook the roof, threatening to bury the world in white. Inside, the fire's crackle and the dog's shallow breaths filled the quiet. For a fleeting moment, he almost convinced himself the house had come alive again. His mind drifted unbidden to Claire. She had been petite, 5 feet 4 inches tall, with auburn curls that bounced when wet, and eyes the color of fresh summer grass. She laughed easily, but was stubborn, grounding him whenever the Marine Corps threatened to strip away every part of him but the steel. Her death was quiet, a swift illness that overwhelmed him, leaving him grasping at shadows. He remembered holding her hand in the hospital, hearing her whisper, "Keep living, Matt." For years he had failed at that command, merely existing, rather than truly living. Yet now, with Valor and Grace helpless before his fire, that command stirred anew inside him. The storm howled through the night beyond midnight, but Matthew never broke his vigil. He shifted the dogs closer to the flames, careful not to let them overheat, draping an old quilt over them. Every so often, Valor's eyes would open, studying him, never fully surrendering, yet never raising alarm. Grace pressed closer to him, her swollen belly rising and falling. Matthew studied her, a gnawing worry tightening his chest. She was far along, too far gone. He knew enough about animals to read the signs. If stress triggered her labor, the night would bring not just survival, but new life. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "One thing at a time, Harris. First keep them alive, then face the miracles." Hours passed. The fire sputtered low, then flared again as he fed it. The storm outside screamed on, but inside the room held its fragile warmth. When exhaustion finally weighed heavy on his eyes, Matthew knew one truth with absolute clarity. He had taken them in reckless or not, and now their lives were irrevocably intertwined with his. This was his mission, not an order from any commander. This wasn't a battle marked on any map, but 2 fragile souls who had placed their trust in him in their darkest hour. He vowed he wouldn't let them down, so he remained by their side on the worn rug, snug beneath his blanket, listening to the storm raging outside and the gentle breaths of courage and hope within. The storm outside refused to relent, snow relentlessly pelting the ranch house windows, tapping like countless icy fingers against the ancient glass. Beyond those panes, the world had faded into a swirling white haze, yet inside the living room glowed with the steadfast warmth of the fire. The braided rug before it had transformed from a battleground into a sanctuary. 2 German shepherds, Valor and Grace, nestled deep in Matthew Harris's heavy coat, steam gently rising from their soaked fur. Their breaths were shallow, their bodies still trembling, but they were alive. Matthew stood from the rug, dusting his hands on his worn trousers. His muscles ached from the arduous struggle of carrying them through the storm, but his mind was alive, sharp with purpose. The scent of wet fur filled the air, stirring an almost forgotten feeling. The presence of life. For 4 long years, this house had been a quiet shell, a place where memories felt heavier than sound. Tonight, with these 2 dogs clinging to life by a thread, the home breathed again, as though it exhaled a sigh of relief. He reached for the old rotary phone on the wall, the one Claire insisted they keep, despite stronger cell signals now. The line crackled softly in his ear as he dialed the number taped beside the fridge. After 2 rings, a voice came through Carter Veterinary. "This is Emily. Dr. Carter, it's Harris," Matthew answered, his voice low and steady but lined with urgency. "I've got 2 shepherds here on the ridge nearly frozen. One's pregnant." There was a pause, then the subtle sound of papers shuffling. "Matthew, I didn't expect this." Emily's tone shifted, brisk and businesslike, though not without compassion. "Tell me exactly what you've done so far." Emily Carter was known across Elkridge as a woman who carried herself as if always just a step ahead of heartbreak. Tall and lean, she held herself with the quiet strength of someone unafraid to face whatever came. But what truly lingered in people's minds were her eyes, pale hazel, thoughtful, the kind that measured a soul before offering judgment. Her dark hair was cropped just below her chin, easy to pull back for work, threaded with streaks of gray that spoke less of age and more of life's relentless toll. 6 years ago, a car accident on an icy highway near Denver claimed her husband, and since then she poured every ounce of herself into healing animals, patching what she could even when she couldn't mend her own brokenness. Folks whispered she was distant, sometimes sharp-tongued, but she was always the first to answer when someone needed help, whether it was a neighbor or a stray left bleeding by the roadside. "I wrapped them in my coat and brought them by the fire," Matthew said, keeping his eyes on Valor and Grace. "They've only taken a little water," good Emily replied, her voice clipped but approving. "Warm them slowly. If you rush, their systems might shut down. Keep the room dim and quiet. No food yet, only a few sips of water at a time. Do you have clean towels? You?" "I do. Good. Use them. Rub gently. Keep the blood flowing, especially for the female. Stress could trigger labor." Her voice faded. "You'll need to be her strength through the night." Matthew closed his eyes, feeling the heavy weight of her words press down on him. "You'll need to be her rock through the night." Matthew shut his eyes for a moment, feeling the heavy burden settle deep within him. He muttered quietly, "Understood." Years spent deep in the core had taught him how to follow orders, but never from a voice so calm, so quietly burdened with weight. He returned to the living room, rifling through the linen closet, pulling out towels Claire had set aside for visitors. He knelt once more beside the dogs. Valor's eyes fluttered open as the warm cloth brushed against his side. The old male emitted a soft growl, not hostile, just cautious. "Easy, boy," Matthew murmured, gently rubbing the towel over his limbs, coaxing life back into muscles stiff from cold. Grace lay still, but when he stroked the dampness from her belly, her ear twitched, and a faint sighing whimper escaped her. The house seemed to breathe along with them. Every tiny breath, every subtle movement wove warmth into the emptiness around them. Matthew layered one towel over them, then another, crafting a cocoon of comfort. His hands moved with seasoned care, the same steady touch he once used to tend wounds on distant battlefields. But this was different. These were not armed brothers ready to fight. These were souls offering only their pure trust, or nothing at all. The phone clicked softly as Emily's voice returned. "Matthew, keep the lines open tonight. I'll check in when I can. Roads won't clear until morning. They're in your care until then." He stared at the receiver long after the call ended. "They're yours." The words echoed louder than the roaring storm outside. He sank back in his recliner, pulling a wool blanket across his legs, eyes never leaving the dogs. Valor lifted his head weakly, watching him, amber eyes full of quiet judgment. Grace inched closer to her partner, her swollen belly resting against his side. Matthew whispered softly, "Valor, Grace, that's who you are." Naming them was like planting flags, small beacons of hope fighting the blizzard's desolation. The hours limped by. Matthew tended the fire, swapped sodden towels, offered small bowls of warm water. Words were few, but his steady presence filled the room, his measured breath syncing with theirs. Outside, the storm roared like an unleashed beast. Inside, 3 lives, a man and 2 dogs clung to their fragile shared warmth. For the first time in years, Matthew felt the house breathe with him, not as a mausoleum of memories, but as a living refuge, a sanctuary. And in the silence between the wind's fury, he swore he heard Claire's voice again, faint but approving. "Keep living, Matt." The storm outside still raged with the force of a freight train hammering the ranch house unrelentingly. Windows trembled in their frames. The eaves moaned beneath drifts of snow, and the air carried the heavy, constant roar of Wyoming's fiercest winter. Inside, though, the fire burned bright, casting golden amber hues across the room, guarding a fragile warmth against the cold night. On the braided rug before the hearth, Grace stirred, the young German shepherd. Her tan and black coat, still dulled from dampness, shifted uneasily, her swollen, taut belly faintly rippling beneath her skin. Matthew Harris, wrapped in a wool blanket in his recliner, had just drifted off when a soft, broken whine roused him, a sound unlike her earlier whimpers. He leaned forward at once, eyes locked and sharp. Valor, the elder dog, was the first to respond. His head lifted amber eyes, intense ears flicking despite his weariness. He let out a low sound, not a growl, but a worried rumble, gently nudging Grace's muzzle. She gasped, her legs twitching. Matthew's heart tightened. He had witnessed pain before in battlefields and hospital wards. Yet this was a new kind of ache, but everything felt different now. This wasn't life breaking apart. It was life bursting forth, raw, fierce, and daunting. He rose swiftly, reaching for the phone. His fingers spun the rotary dial with urgent purpose. The line crackled, and after 2 sharp rings, Dr. Emily Carter's voice came through steady yet edged with static. "Emily, it's Harris again." Silence held for a moment, then the shuffle of papers, her tone sharpening. "All right, Matthew. Listen carefully. You'll need clean towels and warm water. Keep the room dim and quiet. Give her space, yet stay near. Dogs are mighty mothers, but stress, cold, and exhaustion can complicate things. If anything seems off, if the pup gets stuck, you have to act." "Do you understand?" Matthew clenched his jaw. "I understand." His Marine training had drilled calm clarity in storms, but this wasn't a battlefield. This was a sacred moment, life arriving in his living room, fragile and fierce. He hung up, raced to the linen closet, pulling towels that Claire had once folded with care, neatly stacked untouched for years. His chest tightened, memories flooding of her hands, smoothing fabric, her soft humming filling the quiet room. He returned to Grace's side, kneeling down. Valor shifted closer, pressing his nose gently against her, as if lending strength. The first contraction hit hard. Grace yelped, arching her back before collapsing onto the towels. Matthew murmured, "Easy, girl, you've got this." His voice was low and soothing, the same gentle tone he once used to steady scared recruits before their first dive into danger. He spoke not just to her, but to himself, grounding himself against the storm raging outside and the tempest roaring inside. Minutes stretched long. He rubbed her side softly, keeping her warm, with the towels offering a small bowl of water that she lapped once, then looked away. Valor never left her side. Every time her body tensed, he leaned in closer, amber eyes locked on Matthew, as if silently commanding him not to falter now. Just after midnight, the first pup arrived. Tiny blind, wrapped in a shimmering membrane glowing in the firelight. Grace's maternal instincts surged alive. With fierce determination, she tore it away, licking the newborn with trembling care. The pup emitted a piercing, fragile squeak that cut through the night's howl. Matthew exhaled the breath he didn't know he'd held. Then came the second pup, followed by the third. Each time Grace struggled, body-racked Valor watching with unwavering devotion. Matthew swapped out soaked towels, offered steady, supportive hands. When Grace faltered too deeply, he whispered gentle encouragement, as though she could understand every word, his heart pounding a beat he hadn't felt since Claire handed him their first dog's fragile body 20 years ago, a golden retriever named Daisy. The fourth pup lagged stuck for a long moment that choked Matthew's throat. He remembered Emily's words, breathed steady, and eased the tiny life free with careful hands. Grace immediately turned, licked furiously, until another weak squeak filled the room. Matthew let out a shaky laugh, relief spilling from him like decompression after an explosion. By the time the fifth pup arrived, the storm outside had softened the wind's rage, settling into tired moans against the house. Grace collapsed back on the towels, panting hard but victorious eyes closing as 5 tiny bodies wriggled against her belly. Each pup instinctively nuzzled close for warmth, their soft whimpers blending into a delicate symphony of new life. Matthew sank down onto his heels, his eyes blurred with tears. He hadn't shed a tear in years, not even when they laid Claire beneath the earth. But now, witnessing this fragile miracle amid the raging blizzard, he let the tears flow freely. Quietly, he whispered, "You did it, Grace, you truly did." Valor curled around his mate and pups, his body forming a shield of protection. He lifted his head toward Matthew Amber, eyes steady, full of a quiet gratitude. Matthew locked eyes with him and saw something unexpected there, trust. Deep, solemn, and wordless. Leaning back into the recliner, he pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Outside, the storm began to subside. Inside, 5 tiny lives squirmed against their weary mother, guarded by a devoted father and watched over by a Marine who had finally remembered what it meant to fight for hope. For the first time since Claire's passing, the oppressive silence of the house was broken, not by shadows from the past, but by the relentless insistence of life staking its claim in the world. Morning dawned slowly in Elkridge, pale and fragile after the storm's fierce onslaught. The snow had ceased falling, yet drifts rose higher than fences, carved into jagged ridges by the wild winds of the night before. The ranch house sat in a quiet stillness, the kind that comes after chaos, pierced only by the soft crackling of the fire and the faint squeaks of newborn pups. On the braided rug, Grace lay curled protectively around her 5 pups. Her tan and black frame, still thin from hardship, rose and fell. With slow, exhausted breaths, her sides pressed tenderly against the tiny bundles of fur. Each little pup writhed blindly, their cries piercing yet fragile. Valor, his bigger frame stretched out in a protective arc beside them, had barely slept. His amber eyes searched every sound, every movement, the fierce instincts of a father, unwilling to lower his guard. Nearby, Matthew Harris sat, slouched in his recliner blanket draped over his lap. He hadn't allowed himself more than brief moments of rest all night. Every whimper from the pups or subtle shift from the mother snapped him awake, now in the soft dawn light. He rubbed at his weary eyes and gazed upon this fragile family with a mixture of breathtaking awe and bone-deep exhaustion. A sudden knock at his door startled him. He hadn't expected anyone brave enough to face the storm so soon. Stiffly rising, he crossed the room and opened the door. 3 figures stood on his porch, thick snow crusting their coats. At the front was Dr. Emily Carter, tall and lean, her hazel eyes sharp despite the gray morning light. She carried herself with quiet authority, a woman accustomed to taking charge when lives depended on her care. Her parka was dusted in white, her gloved hand steady despite the biting cold. Behind her were 2 men, one short and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a gray beanie pulled low. The other younger, perhaps in his mid-20s, lanky and earnest cheeks flushed red from the cold. "Mr. Harris?" Emily said, her breath misting in the cold air. "We made it." Without a word, Matthew stepped aside, welcoming them into the warm house. The younger man slipped off his gloves, revealing rough hands cracked at the knuckles, marks of hard farm work. He introduced himself softly as Ben Whitaker, a volunteer with the local rescue network, still new enough that his nerves showed in a hesitant smile. The older man was Harold Finch. He was a retired rancher now, dedicating his time as a volunteer for wildlife transport. His weathered face revealed little emotion, but every steady movement spoke volumes of the countless years he'd spent caring for animals and facing emergencies without a word of complaint. Emily slipped off her parka and moved straight to the rug, kneeling with a precision that only years of experience could teach. Her eyes swept over the dogs, resting briefly on Grace's swollen belly before shifting to each pup as they wriggled eagerly toward their mother. She didn't reach out right away, only watched, her gaze narrowing, her lips tightened thoughtfully. After a long pause, she exhaled softly and nodded. They're alive, and given all they've been through, that's nothing short of a miracle. Matthew crouched beside her. All 5, every single one, she confirmed. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a stethoscope and gently checked Grace's chest. Grace shivered, but didn't struggle, her golden eyes flickering between Emily and Matthew. Valor tensed a low growl rumbling from deep within him, yet Emily's steady calm seemed to hold him back. The pups, tiny and sightless, squirmed softly, tangled in their whispered cries. With practiced hands, Emily examined each tiny life, lifting them carefully, weighing, then setting them gently back beside their mother. A faint smile touched her lips at the smallest pup, a runt marked by a white streak on its chest. "Fighters," she whispered softly. Then her eyes shifted to Valor and Grace's ears, where she leaned in close, her brow furrowing as she brushed aside fur to reveal faint tattoos etched beneath the skin. Her expression hardened. "Look here," she said, calling Matthew over. "Do you see these markings?" Matthew bent closer, his jaw tightening. "Identification tattoos." Emily nodded grimly. They were kennel dogs, probably part of an illegal breeding ring. Someone dumped them when they became a burden. Anger blazed hot within Matthew. His gaze locked on the small, faded ink, clear proof, undeniable, and his fists clenched. He muttered under his breath, "Left to die in the storm." His voice was low and burning with fury. Emily's tone softened just a bit. "It happens more than I wish to admit. But you found them, and that made all the difference." She reached out, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "You gave them a chance nobody else would." Ben stepped forward, his young face pale as he took it all in. "So what's next?" Emily straightened, her professionalism returning in full. "We'll transport them. The pups will stay close to their mother until they're strong enough. We'll quarantine them, run thorough medical checks, and make sure they're stable. After that, they'll be placed in a proper rescue facility." Harold Finch, who had stayed silent until now, shifted his weight and spoke with a deep, gravelly voice. "You did right, Harris. Not many would have risked dragging 2 half-frozen shepherds out in that storm. You saved their lives." His words carried the weight of a man who gave praise only when it truly mattered. Matthew nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He watched as Emily prepared carriers, lining them carefully with heated pads and soft blankets. She treated each dog with gentle care, murmuring words of comfort that felt as much for her own heart as for theirs. Valor resisted when they tried to lift him, until Matthew knelt down and placed a soothing hand on his back. "It's all right, boy. They're going to take care of you now." Valor's eyes locked with Matthew's for a moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, the old shepherd allowed himself to be guided gently into the carrier. Grace and the pups followed close behind the little ones, squeaking softly as they were settled into the warmth beside their mother. Emily draped another towel over them, securing their warmth. As the carrier door clicked shut, the fragile family was finally safe. Matthew felt a sudden tightening in his chest, sharp and unexpected. The bar felt emptier, the chatter fading into silence. He suddenly realized how deeply he'd come to rely on their presence, the steady rhythm of their breathing, the warmth they brought to the fire-lit room. Emily caught the look on his face and paused. "They'll be safe, Matthew. You did everything you could." He nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Just don't let them fade from memory." Her hazel eyes softened with understanding. "I swear their lives will be better because of you." Together, the rescuers carried the carriers out into the bright, snowy morning. Matthew stood at the doorway, a blanket draped over his shoulders, watching their figures vanish into the vast white landscape. For the first time since the storm's onset, the sky broke open, spilling light, a pale sun glinting against the untouched snowbanks. He exhaled slowly, the anger lingered, but relief now tempered it. The ranch house behind him sat in an uneasy quiet, yet inside his chest something had shifted. He had chosen to act to save lives others wouldn't dare. And that was enough for now. The mountain town of Jackson, Wyoming, awoke under a soft winter sun. The Tetons jutted sharply on the horizon like frozen guardians. The storm that had ravaged the region days before was now just a memory, leaving streets lined with towering snowbanks and roofs bowed under heavy white blankets. Jackson had weathered such storms before, but even here, this blizzard was one for the history books. At the heart of town, the Jackson Animal Rescue and Rehabilitation Center stood on a broad lot hemmed in by towering pine trees and a tall chain-link fence. The building was more functional than beautiful. Weathered brick walls stood firm against years of cold, broad windows pouring in pale daylight. But inside, warmth thrived. Heat lamps glowed gently in kennels. Staff voices blended with barking and excited chatter, and the air was thick with the comforting scents of straw and disinfectant. Valor and Grace had been moved into a corner suite, larger than most. Padded with thick bedding and warmed by overhead heaters, Grace, though still lean from her struggles, had quickly regained strength. Her coat now shone brushed clean of ice and dirt, her golden eyes burning with fresh life. She curled protectively around her pups, who had doubled in size in just a few short weeks, their soft ears still floppy, their voices bursting with untamed energy. Each pup carried echoes of their parents' colors, deep blacks and warm tan streaks of cream. One even bore a white star on its chest, like a badge of honor. Valor remained their steadfast sentinel, older now, his stride heavier, but still strong. His scarred muzzle and fierce amber gaze gave him an aura of quiet command that the staff admired deeply. He patrolled the edge of the kennel, ever vigilant, only relaxing when Grace or the pups called him back with gentle nudges or playful squeals. The center's staff had quickly grown attached. Among them was Sarah Martinez, a woman in her early 30s with a tall, slender frame and thick, dark curls often tucked beneath a wool cap. Her olive-toned face featured sharp cheekbones and gentle brown eyes that seemed to carry the weight of everything she'd seen. Sarah had grown up in Jackson, but left for college in Seattle, only to return after her younger brother's tragic overdose tore her family apart. Since that day, she had poured her heart into the rescue center, often saying animals don't lie like people sometimes do. Practical and brisk, when under pressure beneath it all, ran a deep well of compassion. Sarah dedicated countless hours with gentle strength, crouching down to their level, letting them slowly grow comfortable with her presence. She whispered soft encouragements, scratched behind their ears, and praised them whenever they let her handle the little pups. "You carry the heart of survivors," she told them once, leaning gently against the kennel door. "And survivors always find new beginnings." Weeks later, Matthew Harris made the drive into Jackson. The winding mountain roads, freshly plowed, stirred unease deep within him. Since Claire's passing, he'd grown accustomed to solitude, and bustling towns filled with noise felt alien. Yet as he parked outside the center and stepped inside the cozy warmth, he felt the reason for his visit firmly in his heart. Sarah greeted him first, her smile sincere, though tinged with a touch of shyness. "Mr. Harris, you're the Marine who found them, aren't you?" Matthew nodded, brushing snow from his jacket. "Just Matthew. I did what anyone in my place would do." "Not everyone would," she replied, her gaze unwavering. She beckoned him to follow. "Come on, they'll be thrilled to see you." The hall buzzed with sounds, dogs barking, cats yowling, volunteers chatting softly as they cleaned up. Matthew felt the heaviness of it all, but Sarah's calm presence steadied him. She moved with quiet patience, the kind born from personal loss and healing. When they reached the kennel, the response was immediate. Valor's head jolted up, ears perked like sentinels, and his tail thumped twice against the floor. Grace followed, her golden eyes softening with recognition. The pups, now lively balls of energy, tumbled forward clumsily, scrambling over each other, their sharp barks echoing in the room. Matthew knelt closer, lowering himself to their level. The pups pressed eagerly against the wire, tiny paws scrambling to reach him. One bravely licked his fingers through the mesh. Another yipped until Valor gave a gentle nudge, as if to remind them to stay calm. For the first time in years, Matthew felt his throat tighten, not from sorrow, but from a warm surge filling the hollow inside. His eyes blurred as he whispered, "Do you remember me?" Sarah silently watched from behind, arms loosely crossed. She had witnessed many reunions, but this one carried a unique weight. This wasn't just animals greeting their savior. It was family recognizing family. Grace let out a soft whine, pressing closer to the mesh with her pups gathering tightly around her. Valor stood solid beside her, his gaze locked on Matthew with steady acceptance. It was as if he too acknowledged the man who had pulled them from the brink of death. Matthew lingered for long minutes, hand pressed to the wire, eyes moist but unabashed. He didn't speak of Claire, though she filled his thoughts. Instead, he allowed the presence of Valor, Grace, and their pups to voice the words he'd long been unable to find, words of healing, new beginnings, and a love that defied the coldest winters. When he finally rose, Sarah gently placed her hand on his arm. "They're strong now. They'll be all right." He nodded, voice rough but certain. "And so will I." Springtime in Wyoming never arrived quietly. The thaw unfolded like a slow victory ice, cracking along frozen rivers, snow retreating bit by bit, and patches of brown earth breaking through the white. In Jackson, though the season carried a promise of rebirth, the Tetons still wore crowns of snow, but the valleys below gleamed with fresh sunlight, hinting at life beginning anew. Matthew Harris stood outside the Jackson Animal Rescue and Rehabilitation Center, his coat unbuttoned for the first time in many months. The crisp air carried just a faint reminder of winter's chill. In one hand, he clutched a thick envelope, the kind reserved for messages of great importance. The invitation had arrived several days before the grand unveiling of the community's new training and education wing. Inside, a note penned in Emily Carter's unmistakable handwriting read, "We would be honored if you would join us, Matthew. They're waiting for you." Inside the center, banners stretched across the walls, simple yet heartfelt in meaning. Folding chairs lined the main hall, while the scent of fresh paint mingled with hay and the earthy aroma of animals. Local families had come together, children pulling gently at their parents' sleeves, their eyes wide with anticipation to meet the dogs who had become local legends. Valor and Grace had been named ambassadors of the program, as Emily proudly called them. No longer the frost-bitten survivors Matthew had carried from the storm. They now stood upright and dignified, their coats gleaming softly beneath the warm lights. Grace's eyes sparkled with quiet pride, surrounded by her 5 lively, mischievous pups tumbling at her feet. Valor's lean frame bore the marks of his age, yet his presence filled every corner of the room. He moved with a strength not needing to be shown, just calm, assured confidence. As Matthew stepped into the hall, the atmosphere subtly changed. The pups yipped excitedly, scrambling to the edge of their enclosure. Grace's ears twitched, and Valor sharply turned his head, amber eyes locking onto the man who had saved them. Step by steady step, Valor moved forward until he rested his paw against the glass. That simple touch spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement, a heartfelt thank you, and perhaps a bond forged beyond any storm or set distance. Matthew's breath hitched. He lifted his hand, mirroring the gesture by pressing it against the glass opposite Valor's paw. For a fleeting moment, the room's noise dimmed, leaving behind only the quiet hum of connection. From behind him, Sarah Martinez approached her tall, graceful figure, clad in a modest navy sweater and jeans. Her brown eyes softened as she glanced from Matthew to the dogs. "They understand," she whispered. "Animals never forget kindness, and neither do people." Sarah had become a pillar of the center, her steady strength and shared history of loss creating a deep bond with every creature she cared for. She had transformed grief into purpose, evident in the gentle way she knelt, scratching behind a pup's ear with a heartfelt smile. Soon, Emily Carter joined them, clipboard in hand, her hazel eyes sharp yet warm. She had swapped her heavy winter parka for a lighter coat, though faint lines of exhaustion still touched her brow. "They've come so far," she told Matthew, her voice calm and sure. "Because of you, they're here to teach others what true responsibility means. No more abandoned animals left to suffer. That's the vision." The ceremony began unpretentious, deeply sincere. A local official offered a brief speech thanking donors and volunteers. Children laughed as the pups tugged playfully at ribbons. Sarah guided Valor forward, his steady calm embodying resilience itself. Grace followed her pups, darting through her legs, drawing smiles and warmth from everyone present. Matthew stood quietly at the back. Hands clasped his heart, heavy, yet filled with an unexpected peace. He thought of Claire, her laughter, her warmth, the way she once filled every corner of their home with life. For years, silence had weighed unbearably after her passing. But now, watching Valor place his paw against the glass, he felt something else stirring a quiet hope. Hearing the joyful barks of the puppies, he understood something profound. The silence was no longer a void. It became a space ready to be filled once again. That evening, back at his ranch, the fire crackled steadily in the hearth, as it always had. Still, the atmosphere in the room felt transformed. The memory of Valor's paw, Grace's gaze, and the pup's vibrant energy hummed like glowing embers deep in his heart. Leaning back into his recliner, with a wool blanket draped over his lap, he allowed the comforting warmth to seep into his soul. For the first time in countless years, he no longer felt alone. The lonely house, once a sanctuary of sorrow, now held something altogether different. It held the memory of a miracle, the tiny spark of life that had chosen his rug amid the fierce storm. With a gentle smile, he realized it wasn't just the dogs who had been saved that night. They had unknowingly returned to him something he didn't realize he was missing: hope. In the heart of the tempest, when all seemed lost, life stubbornly found a way. That night on Matthew's worn rug, 5 delicate puppies were born, bringing with them a powerful reminder miracles still unfold. Sometimes they arrive through the steady hands of a Marine carrying 2 shivering dogs. Sometimes through the quiet fortitude of a mother fighting to bring her young into the world. And always through the grace of God watching over both man and beast. In our everyday lives, storms manifest in many forms: loss, loneliness, fear, or hardship. But just like Matthew opened his door to save Valor and Grace, we too can open our hearts to love, compassion, and new beginnings. Each act of kindness ignites a spark. Every helping hand has the power to transform a life, and every prayer brings us closer to hope. If this story moved you, please share it with others. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to never miss another message of hope. Type Amen in the comments as a heartfelt prayer of gratitude for the miracles we are privileged to witness. Big or small, may God richly bless you and your loved ones, and may His grace guide you through every storm you face.